you. We are going to see today two cases, the one of Mexico City, and then we are going to see California during a severe drought. So this is Mexico City, the place where I grew up, and I'm going to introduce to you the city, the greater Mexico City. What are the problems in terms of water? And then, like yesterday, let's think, what do we learn or what can we learn for India, both from Mexico and what can India learn from Mexico? I don't think very much, but what can Mexico learn from India also, from cities in India? When we talk about water and wastewater management, we think in terms of access, in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. We also consider that there is an energy cost, that that we require energy to produce. We require energy to produce water and water to produce electricity. We therefore look as population and also as managers. They look for water reuse, for water recycling, for wastewater treatment. And we know all the health and environmental impacts that there are when water is not treated properly. Mexico and India are two examples in the world, two wrong examples of irrigating with raw wastewater. And we're very famous in the world, and we portray it as an example, and it's just an example of a failure in terms of management and well, in general in terms of management. And lately in the discussions, in the national policies and international discussions, we hear the word resilience. And there is all this type of words that are used according to the movements in the world. We have gone through sustainability, we have gone through governance. Now we are in the age of resilience. And we tend to associate it with climate change. And what the IPCC and the government says and the government repeat is that the systems are resilient. And what they mean basically is that we can survive as population, as cities, we can survive and we can continue with our lives in spite of different type of shocks. There is no such thing as becoming resilient because the system is always changing, but that we become basically, can go on with our lives. So this is Mexico. Mexico is located in the American continent, south of US, where the wall is going to be built. There is where Mexico is. This is US, this is Mexico. We are about 110 million people. And these are just some statistics, they are in Spanish, but what I want you to focus on is on the graphics. In 1950, there were about 28 million people, and there were about 18,000 cubic meters per person. Several decades later, in 2015, we are 110 million people. Per capita use of water has become a fraction of what was before, 3,600. This is because population has increased, but also because there is less water and because it is more polluted, so we can use it less. Now let's go to the bottom of this drawing, of this slide, where we have overexploited aquifers. 1975, they show a number of drops. That means these were the number of overexploited aquifers. 2015, they have increased by more than 4 times. This takes me to the same thing. We have uses, and the number of uses and uses have increased. And we continue having the same amount of water or less. Less because it's polluted and less because it is scarce. Now we go to Mexico City and to Greater Mexico City. Greater Mexico City is about 22 million people. It includes the capital city, which is Mexico City, the state of Mexico in its totality, more than 50 municipalities, plus one more municipality of another state. It is in this city where, as it happens in most of the countries, there is most of the GDP. There is where we have governments, the schools, many important economic activities. And so what happens is that the governments try to provide the best services because the governments are there, because they live there, they as the most important political figures live there, and also because you have most of the population. In this part, we have about 25% of the population, and increasing. And nobody knows, as it happens here in India, in the very big cities. We don't know by how much it's increasing simply because of immigration is something you cannot control. There are very few places where immigration can be controlled, and Mexico, Greater Mexico City is not one of them. So the way in which the city gets the water is, and we are going to see it in detail, is 30% surface water, mostly from outside the basin, and 70% of groundwater from an aquifer which is overexploited. We have an abstraction which is more than double of the recharge, and it has been like that for many decades. So you have a city that continues, and in that is very similar to cities in India, a city that continues growing in terms of population and also of economic activities, and where your sources of water are less and they are more polluted. Mexico City. Now let's go from Greater Mexico to Mexico City. So Mexico City, that it will be the most of the focus of this talk now, it was established in 1321 on a lake, on a series of lakes. There were 5 lakes. At that time, the population knew, it was very small, but the population knew how to manage the water. And they knew that they shouldn't dry up the lake because they were living on top of the lake. We were conquered by the Spaniards. And with time, the engineering thought and the knowledge at that time was that they should dry it up. So they dry up the lake, the sets of lakes, and everybody was very happy until subsidence started occurring. And it's something you cannot stop because it's natural. So you have the type of soil is clay, and then you have volcanic rock in some places. But that means that the city is very big. The city doesn't sink as a whole, but parts of the city sink. So we have a city that was established on a lake. Main part of the city is still on what used to be the bed of the lake, but you have about 8.9 million people. We are surrounded by mountains. We cannot see here because of pollution, a very heavily polluted area, and a place where density of population can be 10,000 persons per square kilometer. And again, remember, the sources of water are very, very limited. Again, another view of Mexico City. This is Greater Mexico. But we have the capital city, which is Mexico City. We have the state of Mexico, 14 million people, 8 million people here. And here, the small dot in yellow, or the small part in yellow, that is a state, a municipality in another state. And we are going to see why that is important. The city is surrounded by mountains, and it's a closed basin. So hydrologically thinking in a closed basin with clay soil and with aquifer that is overexploited. Now, this is the place where we are living, so many millions of people, where we have most of the economic activities of the city. Now let's see the place without people, and let's see the place without economic activity. This is what we have. Remember yesterday we said that the context always matters. Again, we are surrounded by mountains. We're in a place that used to be a lake. So this is Mexico City. We have not, it is not entirely urban. As Delhi, I'm sure, is not entirely urban. There are many areas where there is agriculture, more or less degree. In the case of Mexico City, the southern part is the agricultural land use. Plus, but you have agriculture all over, but this is agricultural land use. And this is population. This is the way in which population is distributed. We have in these areas less population because it is agriculture, but not only because of that. This is the area of recharge of the aquifer. So during decades, policy-wise, it has been decided that there wouldn't be settlements in this area, precisely so that the aquifer could be recharged. However, it is in this area, not only here, but in all this area, where there is volcanic rock. And pipes have not been constructed because of the type of rock. And what has happened is that in this area, there are septic tanks, which are not cleaned properly. So most of the pollution of the aquifer is happening exactly in the area where the recharge naturally happens. and we have different density of population. Now let's think on this city with this amount of people and the services we have to provide. And we are focusing on water and wastewater services. And when we say water, it's not only water in terms of quantity, but water in terms of quality. What type of quality do population get? Why are we the second city in the world that drinks more bottled water? Small bottles and the 30 liters containers. And precisely it's because of the poor quality of the water. Now this is Mexico City. This is Mexico City, greater Mexico City. In this area is Mexico City. These two in the southeast are two very famous volcanoes. The state of Mexico is here. State of Mexico goes all around Mexico City, like if it was giving it a big hug, and the water comes from this part. But before we take any decision on a city, before we can decide whether the policy that is being taken is appropriate or not, we have to go back to the basics. Where our cities are located, always. A city in a tropical area, like yesterday Singapore, is very different from a city which is at 2,500 meters above sea level, and which is in a closed basin and which is in the mountains. So this is where our cities grow, and this is from where we draw the resources. And that's why sometimes it's more difficult than another times, because sometimes you have to bring the water from very far away. It is exactly the same slide, except that now what we have is the Mexico City superimposed. So this red area we see is the population, well, is the city where the population is. This is where we discharge the raw wastewater, undiluted wastewater. It is diluted in rainy season. All the wastewater goes, the wastewater that is produced in Mexico City, it goes to the irrigation districts. It is first stored in dams. If it is rainy season, it is going to be diluted, and then it goes to the irrigation districts. If it's not rainy season, it's simply distributed. That's what many places also do in India. We irrigate with wastewater, and we do not only irrigate. We are not sophisticated. We don't irrigate flowers. We irrigate crops because that's for which we have a market. And this brings enormous amount of problems in terms of health and also pollution. So we have Mexico City then that brings the water from this infrastructure that you cannot see well because it's superimposed, but we are going to see in the next slide. But you have to bring water from about 30% of the water you need from more than 100 or 200 kilometers far away, as it happens in many cities. And then this is 30% of the water. 70% of the water comes from the aquifer. That has been, remember, overexploited for centuries. This is the infrastructure. So now let's take the infrastructure out of the city. This is the infrastructure. We have again the Mexico City that is taking the water from the aquifer. And then we have this infrastructure which all cities have. Once in a point in history, they settled in places where there was water. That is one of the main requirements for any city. And as time passes, we use the water, overuse, pollute, or we grow too much and the water is not enough. So we start bringing water every time from places which are farther. What I want to show you here is infrastructure development. And it comes to this is the main part. Our source where the production of water is about 15,240 cubic meters per second. This is our water. It's not enough. And it's not enough to bring to Mexico City because this water has another purposes than coming only to Mexico City. This water is used by people who live in the state of Mexico, and only 13 cubic meters per second go to the city. That is the 30%. The government has been trying, federal government, the state government, have been trying to withdraw more water, 5 cubic meters per second from this area, from this river. And there has been opposition for decades because people live here, they require the water, it's for agricultural purposes, and there is a lot of poverty. So I think it's one of the places where there have been opposition for many years. and the government, federal and state government, decided not to take this water. So they are looking for another sources we are going to see. We look for sources, and our cities, mainly when they are the capitals, mainly when they are commercial centers, they have the funding to pay for the water, or they don't pay. That is basically paid, subsidized by federal government or by state governments. And this is what has happened in Mexico City for many years. Mexico City brings water from the state of Mexico, but it doesn't pay for the water. It's just an old agreement. And it will continue to exist because you have the capital. Now, something else to consider. You may remember that some years ago, the World Economic Forum came out with some outstanding findings. That was that there is a relation between water and energy. And they discovered it while the rest of the world already knew, right? There is a relation between water and energy. You need energy to produce water, and you need water to produce energy. The difference with the World Economic Forum is that they brought a business perspective, and they basically disseminated it. So after the World Economic Forum said, look, there is a relation between energy and water, the world said, oh yes, there is, except that had always existed, and every engineer knows that there is a relation between water and energy. But we need this international forum to attract attention to certain aspects, like the sustainability and the resilience. We need it, because that means that there is more attention, and that means that there is more funding, and that there means that there are ways to improve the systems. In the natural systems and human-made systems, man-made systems. What is the situation in Mexico City? Not only all this amount of water is brought from hundreds of kilometers away, but it has to be pumped from 16 meters above sea level to 2018, and then a fall to 250 where the city is. So this is an enormous amount of, this is enormous expenditure in terms of electricity. And what, at some point years ago, it was mentioned that the amount of energy that was required for Mexico City to run, to bring the water, this is pumped up, and we are going to see that because the city has been subsiding, the wastewater has to be pumped up in order to take it out from the closed basin. So you have energy to bring the water, energy to get rid of the wastewater, and then we have an open canal for wastewater, and you need pumps. Because the city has been subsiding so much that now we are going to see the land is just, we are going to see it is negative. So you have to pump all the wastewater from whatever point where it is being produced, you have to pump it up. And this requires about 20% of the electricity that is produced in the country. 20%, only for one city. Because of management, because of the place where it is located, and because too much water has been extracted from the aquifer, which is what has resulted in all this. Again, the cities do not subside. Bangkok has not subsided. Mexico City has not subsided. Parts of the city have. But there are many problems because of those parts of the cities, because of all the impact, all the deterioration that brings, for example, for infrastructure. It simply breaks. So what is our infrastructure? Dams, tunnels, canals, pumping stations, water treatment plants. They come to the city. A certain percentage of the water is lost, and then you bring it all the way from far away, and you treat it, and it gets polluted, it gets contaminated in the process because the pipes are not maintained properly, and then you lost up to 20% of the water, and finally you bring it to the house, and people don't clean the water tanks. So people have to buy water because the water is not clean. So it's a whole process of mistakes, a whole process where management, if improved, people finally would have access to clean water because the water at the source is clean. And the water that leaves all the infrastructure is clean. But of course, at the end, you have these parallel parts, wastewater, the clean water. We know if they have not been maintained properly and there are leakages, your water gets contaminated. This is in Spanish, but what I want you to see because I couldn't find it in English. What I want you to see here is what we have in circles. We have a certain amount of rain that is calculated 45 cubic meters per second. This is what we have. In each one of our cities, it starts where the cities are located and your sources of water. Rainfall is the most important. Snow when you have, like in the case of California, groundwater when you have it. And then in our case, the recharge of the aquifer is minimum a third they compare here with extraction. So that is a main problem. Second problem, amount of water that goes into the drains. We have one drain, like in many cities in India, for wastewater and the rainwater. About 90% of the wastewater that is produced is untreated, and it ends up in those irrigation districts are mentioned before. So you have a system where there is no balance, absolutely no balance. You are using more than what you have. You are importing water and still wasting it, and you are polluting because you are not treating. What impact does that have in the life of people like you and me, you living in your cities, home cities in India, me living in Mexico City? Well, it has an impact because of the amount of water we can get, because of the water quality we get, and because of whatever impact in terms of health it can have. In the case of Mexico, we did this study. It was very interesting. Because you see, we all hear that people who get water from tankers, they get lower quality water. And people who get water from tankers, they have to pay more. And everybody is surprised. Why would you be surprised? We all are subsidizing our houses. We pay very little. However, if you have to pay to a tanker, you have to pay whatever they charge you, or whatever favors they ask you to give to them. Otherwise, you don't have the water. So there is a bigger payment. Those who are in houses, those who receive tap water, they are better off. Always. It doesn't matter the quality of the water. It will be much better than the water of the wells in these areas because they are very polluted, and also the quality of the water that is in the tankers. We have, the darker the color, and there is not much difference. The darker the color is the number of houses that do not have drinking water. Not only water, but water that is drinkable. There is all this movement in the world that says that water should be a human right, meaning that we should all receive it with good quality and it shouldn't be paid, except it doesn't work. We need funding for maintenance, funding for operation. So perhaps water as a human right should mean that we all receive water at an affordable price and water that is clean to drink. And there are many people that say that there is discrimination, which there will always be, unfortunately, and that poorest people get water which is bad quality. Well, in this place, we all receive water which is bad quality, everybody. So there is no discrimination. Everybody is bad, except the poorest people are located in worse places, so they receive less water. But the situation is bad. Bad in the sense that there is not an institution that is efficient. All that we were discussing yesterday about Singapore, that's very far away from Mexico. There is efficiency, there is accountability, there is the famous KPIs, which is your performance indicators. In Mexico City, we don't have anything like that, anything. We just have a mass of people who have to be served the best way. We want to think that we will get clean water. I've never drank water from the tap. And people who have to drink from the tap is because there is absolutely no other option. Now let's see the sewage, because sewage is a main reason why water is not clean. Again, houses without sewage infrastructure, we see them here in yellow, in red, and they are showing here the areas where their housing doesn't have infrastructure, which are the same areas where people have the worst quality of water and people who receive the lowest amount of water. So the main problems are in the same places. And then we go to the socioeconomic level of the city. Where is it that richer people live and poorer people live? Again, remember, we all receive water which is poor quality. In 90% of the cases, wastewater is not treated, so everybody receives a poor service, everybody. But the people who are poor receive worse service, mostly because they receive the water by tankers, or because there is no, in most of the city there are the sewage pipes, but the maintenance varies a lot. So there are places where when it rains in the city, there are places that are going to get flooded with wastewater because the maintenance of the pipes has not been appropriate, but also because in those places the city has subsided. So at some point the collectors they are at a different level. The rain one, your collectors are at a different level. We have only one infrastructure for rainwater and wastewater. And when it rains heavier than what the system can cope, you just have wastewater all over because the wastewater comes out. So you have to be very careful if you are in the city when we have one of the big floods, because it's likely to be wastewater. So let's remember, this is just to summarize. We have the city in a closed basin, very different than if you have a city in an arid area or if you have it in an open basin surrounded by mountains. We are discharging wastewater or diluted water. If it is rainy season, we have to bring water from outside. And in the process, we are depleting the aquifer where we are. And now let's talk about subsidence. Subsidence, a problem of many cities, not only Mexico City. What is being done? And basically, not very much. So what we have here is this image that shows the subsidence rate. And the places, again, the darker areas, the ones in red, are the ones where there has been so much more subsidence. What does this mean for people? This is an image, right? What does it mean for people like you and I? What happens if we live in the places where there has been subsidence? And let's remember the reason is because we are on a lake that has been dry up. And this photograph, don't you think that it's a photograph somebody took and moving the camera? No, this is the way the church is standing. And I don't know how much you can see because of the light, but if not, you will be able to see it on the screens on the sides, that this looks like if it was a wave. And these houses were at some point constructed like a normal construction. In these places, it's just this is the impact of the subsidence. We have it in the area of the airport. Once every certain time, the airport, one of the runways of the airport has to be closed for maintenance, because by then the planes cannot land. And then the next year, they have to give maintenance to the other side. And in the process, we continue using the same aquifer because we don't have another one. Do we have conservation measures? Pricing, non-pricing? Do we treat the water? Do we re-inject it? No. The answer is no for all these questions. So let's see how has subsidence happened in the city. This is 1910. There was a sewage system, and we have a slope that was 19 centimeters per kilometer. We had a city, and I want you to see this part of the slide, because what is going to show here the following years is, well, it just shows that there is subsidence, and you have infrastructure that is damaged. You have pipes, drinking water, wastewater, electricity, whatever is underneath gets broken. By 1950, we had a slope of 12 centimeters per kilometer. At this time, the main drainage collector started being built, and it goes to 100 and 150 meters below the level of the earth, below the soil. In 1970, the slope became 10 centimeters per kilometer, and in 1990, we had lost, the area had lost most of the slope. So what does it occur to you that the government had to do in that moment? What is what you would do as an engineer if you are losing the slope? How do you get rid of the wastewater? Right. So we have pumps all over, because it's the only way to get rid of the wastewater. Because by 1997, the slope was negative, and this is at present. This is already completely negative. So we need more electricity, because the wastewater has to be pumped out. So we need water. We need electricity to bring water. Remember, from several 100 kilometers far away, from 1,600 meters above sea level to 2,800, and then we need more pumps. More electricity to to get rid of the wastewater that is not treated and ends up in the irrigation district. You see, do you find any logic on this? Because this is the way the city is running. And this is one of my favorite slides. Again, this is in Spanish. This is our drainage, our sewage stroke drainage system. Each one of these circles are around names of places that used to be rivers. River in Spanish is rio. So if you read, in all these places it says river. So there was a river. It was a city of lakes. I mean, it was a city of rivers. Each one of them is a wastewater canal. Each one of them. Because it's the only way in which the water utility has non-planned, has thought that the wastewater can be pumped out of the city using the rivers. And that happens in many of our cities. Our rivers are now wastewater canals. So this is what we have in Mexico City, just a lot of wastewater canals. And the irrigation districts are towards this part. So this is where we take the wastewater, untreated, that gets diluted or not. Now, some years ago, the government was warned that the main collector, the one that is 100 and 150 meters below the soil, that had not received maintenance for 50 years. And imagine something without maintenance for 50 years. And they told the government, this is a federal infrastructure, you have to pay for the maintenance. And the government didn't want. So the National Water Commission of Mexico did some simulations. And they explained, look, if the tunnel, if there is a problem and your tunnel breaks, you are going to have thousands of cubic meters of sewage coming out to the city. So that's going to be a main problem in terms of health, a main problem, environmental impacts. But it's going to flood all this area and it's going to affect millions of people. So the government said, nah, cannot be that bad. Remember, we live in countries where things happen and it's really never that bad until it happens. So this was a scenario. If you're, and here we have the airport that I was telling you is one of the parts that have been affected by subsidence. So if your deep tunnel doesn't work, then it's going to affect not only a small area, but actually it can affect millions of people. And it was when the government realized that it could affect actually to millions of people that it finally paid for maintenance. What does maintenance mean? If you go to your drainage, places where they have the diameter is like 50 meters, 5 meters, 6 meters. And what they did is that they enter, how can you clean a place that is full, where the light is about 30 centimeters like this, and everything is silted? What type of maintenance do you give? Yes, let's think. You have to give maintenance. You say you have to give maintenance. You have to see the place is silted. How do we make it work again? What do you do? Again, let's think something practical. What do you do? Come on, ideas. How do you clean a place like that? Ideas? Ladies, gentlemen, what do you do? You break it. How do you break it? You come with machinery and you break it, because there is no other way, because it's been silted for 50 years. I mean, siltation has been building for 50 years. So that was our sophisticated maintenance. They just came with machinery and basically they broke it. And those places where the pipes had to be given maintenance were given maintenance, and then there was water flowing, because you have these 5-meter diameter pipes that were close to 30 centimeters. That's why there was no water. No, there wasn't water, because there had not been maintenance for 50 years. You see the importance of operation and maintenance? And we live in countries where operation and maintenance is not important, where planning is not important. Now, this is a map that has been prepared by the National Center for Disaster Prevention, because at the end this relates to disasters. And they say, they have done these studies, as you can see, 2016, and they say this is the risk of several parts of the city. This is Mexico City and the state of Mexico, several parts of this greater Mexico City of being flooded. Flooded because of rainfall, flooded because of wastewater, flooded because there is subsidence. And the whole place can get flooded. And the highest risk is the one that is in orange. And you see, all the areas that are in orange, so it's the city, the greater metropolitan, I cannot think in English, greater Mexico City, in most of the place gets flooded. And there are severe risks that this happens. We know that every year in rainy season, this is the area that gets flooded, but I mean meters, water and wastewater. So what type of planning do we have to have in a city that has come to this point? You are not going to get rid of 8.9 million people. You are not going to take the government out from there. So what do you do? How do you start improving the situation? And that's where the government is now, because there have not been improvements. And with time, it just gets worse because there is more population. So how did it happen? In addition to having an inefficient government, how did it happen? Happen the same things that happens in all the developing country cities. The growth is very fast. That is the difference between developed countries and developing country cities, that in our cities, the growth is very fast. And it was at some point and continues being, because our population growth is faster, the birth rate is faster, immigration is faster, and the governments cannot cope up with it. Cannot do it in terms of infrastructure development and in terms of planning, because there is no culture of planning. And every time I go back to what Dr. Gupta has been saying, planning is important. So we have, again, well, this is divided, the different colors just show where the growth was at different times in history. 1910, that started in the city, and it started growing as time passed. And now we have become this very big, how are we called? The concrete jungles. Simply is too big, and simply is too much built area. So the aquifers cannot be recharged. There are too many people to provide them with good quality services. We are talking about water and wastewater services, but any service is the same. Think on wastewater collection, or think on electricity, think on environmental services. The quality of life of population, we all who live in this type of cities, is just less. And you may remember that yesterday in the presentation of Singapore, I presented towards the end a diagram they did where they say that people with high population of high density of population tend to have lower quality of life. And they put Singapore here at the top, right? We are fine. Because they are smaller, because they have planned, because they have done it, their processes have been more efficient. However, in the rest of the world, this is where we are. I would say in the left side at the bottom. Quality of life is less precisely because of the environment where we are and because of the type of services we receive. But it started like this. This is exactly how it started in every city in the developing world, because the growth was too much and too fast. We talk about institutions and we talk about governance, another fashionable word. In a main problem in India, in Mexico, and I am sure in many other developing countries, is that our institutions are not strong because our people are not allowed to work without political interference many times. A very good example that Professor Biswas uses is that in Mexico and in India, the heads of the water utilities stay very little time in their positions, so they cannot do anything. By the time you get used to the system, you get to know it, you know weaknesses and strengths, and you know what has to be improved, you are moved to another portfolio. And the next person will come and will have to go through the same process only to be moved. So that is a main failure in terms of management, a main problem. But the other one is the administrative regions by themselves. Again, let's come back to Mexico City. All these that you see divided into small parts, this is the state of Mexico. This is the number of municipalities. This is the number of water utilities we have. So our water utilities don't have any funding because they are very small. And they are normally very inefficient. And they do a very good work considering the type of resources they have. Some time ago, I did a study I liked a lot, which is a study on the water utility of Mexico City, but the wastewater part. So I went to the offices, and they allowed me to go with them and to see the different facilities. So I went to the offices, and they have a big building that doesn't have any fancy desks, doesn't have any fancy computers. People work with their hands, And they are very proud because they have the uniform, which is something relatively new, but basically they have no funding. So how do you manage the institution that is in charge to manage wastewater in a city that is so big and a city that is so complex? And these people, they are considered like the heroes of the city because they have no resources. So many times there is no resources because these resources are being used politically or because the water utilities have not been allowed to be run as business, not as a business thinking that, oh, we are greedy, we are going to overcharge people. No, no, no. As an efficient business, public or private, one that has a business plan, one that knows how much money you have, one that knows how much money you are going to use. And that is a main problem in many developing countries. And I learned yesterday from Dr. Venkatesh also in United States. I always look at US. I guess we all look at US like an efficient place, and no, it's not that much. So it is a problem. Now, if we are here in a big state, we have about 13 million people, and we have this amount of water utilities. How much funds can they have to? We know water utilities are the ones, the municipalities are the ones that are responsible for distribution of clean water. I always stress the clean because sometimes there is distribution of water without being clean. But clean water is a mandate, sanitation, which is the collection, and the treatment. And look at the amount we have. So of course they don't talk to each other. They hardly talk to each other in the same place because many utilities have two persons, the boss and the cashier, and they do exactly every other activity that is necessary. So this is real. We have then problems that are institutional, but we also have problems that come with the administrative divisions. This is the state of Mexico, number of municipalities, most of them poor, and number of water utilities, all of them equally inefficient. So this is the last slide. This is Mexico City. There is very much every city, each one of your home cities without me knowing which one is your home city. We are bringing water. Our resources are from the aquifers when there is groundwater, if not surface water, either from our administrative region or from outside. So there are water transfers in most of the cases. Here, let me show you here in the upper part, there is this area, that's the Mexico City, the greater Mexico City. So we are bringing water from different sources. We have been bringing from, this is the name from Cutzamala, that at some point, the infrastructure per se, and to bring the water in terms of pumping and treating and distributing and then getting rid of the wastewater without treating, because we don't treat it, remember, it was much higher than the budget on education, agriculture, livestock, like 5 or 6 big development areas in the country. And you were using the money only in one project. And it's okay that and it's the type of services we all expect to receive. We expect to receive good services. But was the cost justified? That is much more in your entire budget of education for the country, of agricultural development. And that means there is a failure. That means the management can still be improved. So we bring water from outside, and when we find, like from this basin, we find that people there is reluctancy to allow the development projects, the infrastructure to be developed to take the water out. Instead of becoming efficient, you start planning and bringing water from different basins. So what happens is that our big cities, because they can be mega cities, more than 10 million, but still all our cities are big. They finally, what happens is that they dry up. They source themselves from the regions and from the country in terms of food, in terms of water, in terms of electricity. Our biggest center of population requires resources because we are many. and the governments are willing to do it. The problem is for the environment, natural environment and human environment. This is for the people who are living in the places from where the sources are brought to the cities. They are the ones who lose. And at the end, they are the ones who end up migrating to the cities. So it has an impact because the cities will grow and continue growing, and very few times there is a proper management not to leave the city within the boundaries. This is not physically impossible because it's something that cannot be controlled, but to manage better in order to be efficient. And the next example we are going to see is an example, is a study on food security. So I want to link one with the other even though they are different cases. One of the impacts our big cities have is in terms of food because we bring it from wherever we have to buy. That is okay, we provide a market for those who sell, except that it's not always, again, efficiently managed. But coming back to the city then, we have provision of water from rainfall, from aquifer. We bring it from outside. We get it from tankers. And if we see the people smiling here, it's because it was from the photograph. There is no fun in having to get water from the tankers. No fun at all. And we have the containers of water, the ones I use in my house, since I remember, and we pollute. That's the main thing. We pollute. So when we talk about, every time we talk about water, we should think that after the provision of water comes the production of wastewater, that it will be collected, but then it has to be treated. And the treatment is forgotten. It's forgotten in the cities, and it's forgotten in the big development goals in the world. Do you remember these Millennium Development Goals that were active, that existed until 2015? And after 2015, the world rightly said, no, we should go for more development goals. We should be united, and we should try to improve. Environment, let's live better. Sure, exactly. Wastewater was never considered. It wasn't considered. It was water, and then they said, okay, clean water. And then sanitation, let's collect it. Do we have to treat it? Okay, well, I don't know. So wastewater was not considered until there was one of these global meetings in South Africa. South Africa is a developing country. South Africa said, of course you have to consider wastewater. You treat it, I don't treat it. 70% of the global population doesn't treat it. So wastewater was included. And now it comes as sustainable development goals. Remember, the world is going for certain goals. So now we have wastewater. Do we have the funding? But that is not something for the global community to solve, right? Those are big goals. They are aspirational, but they shouldn't remain aspirational because they come to the life of people like you and I. If they are aspirational for the governments, it's not going to improve. So from aspirational, they have to be, at the end, they have to be goals that we have to implement. Basic things: water, provision of clean water, provision of sanitation services, treatment of wastewater. Because not to have it has an impact in quality of life, and not to have it has an enormous impact in terms of environmental pollution. And the next example I want to show to you is the one I like very much. These discussions that there are in the world. That the world discovered there is a nexus. Remember, now there is a nexus for everything. And then when we study, when we write, we repeat the nexus. We should never repeat things that don't make sense. Remember, we don't look intelligent. We don't look intelligent saying things that don't exist and that don't work. We don't look. But again, in the world, going back to this, to the global meetings and to the international groups, they said there is a nexus. Yes. There is this relation, very important relation between water and energy. Yes. Like did you just find it out? Okay. They just found it out. So they found it out. They found out, the international community found out that there is a relation between water and food. You say, great. I never want that those people be my teachers. Never. Because they just found it out. How else do you produce water? I mean, how else do you produce food? Rain-fed, irrigation, you need water. Okay, well, that is a discovery of the world. So, never repeat in your life nexus, please. You don't look smart. But what happens? What happens when the international community, when the big groups, when the World Economic Forum discovers that there are these nexuses, is that there is more investment. That's why it is important. But it should be important also for our countries. It should be important for people like you and I. That okay, I understand, now I understand, because I'm a smart, rich person that is sitting somewhere, that there is a relation between energy and water. So does that mean that the processes to produce water should be more efficient? Does that mean that I can develop processes through which you produce energy with less water? That is what it should mean, because now the world has understood it. In terms of food, there is a lot of talk about water, food security. And then it is said that food security depends on many things. Food can be available, and if we cannot buy it, that's the end of food security, right? So food has to be available. We have to have the possibility to buy it. We have to waste less. There have been, again, talk for many years, rightly so, trying to call the attention of people like you and I, that food security has many phases. The production, for which you need water, remember, the production, the storage, the transportation, the distribution, and that there is a lot of waste. So let me come back to all this process. In the world, it is said now at present that at some point, the world will run out of water, will run out of food, and we are going to perish. And that will vary depending how good your government is or in what place you live. And basically, it is that there is this disconnect between the amount of food that exists, food that is wasted, and the water that we need. The international organizations say that we need more land and we need more water to produce more food. We say no. I mean, yes, but no. For many years, according to some statistics that I cannot repeat because I don't remember who produced those statistics, all the fruits and vegetables that are wasted in India would be enough to feed everybody who lives in United Kingdom, not in England, but in United Kingdom. Because in India, still the fruits and the vegetables are not processed. There are some other countries where everything is processed. In India, fruits and vegetables are distributed fresh. And there is the way in which it is handled is very poor. An enormous amount of food is wasted. So if we consider, and this is example of India, is in many other places, if we consider the amount of food as the vegetable, as the fruit that is wasted, and if it wasn't wasted, then we wouldn't need to have more land and we wouldn't need to have water for irrigation, right? Okay, so number one, we have understood that. That's why you shouldn't repeat the nexus. You should think on what this means, which is this interrelation and always to think in the context and always to think broader. So we did this study in California because it was during the time of the extended drought, 2011, 2016. I am very interested in what happens in places where there are extreme events. What happens? How do governments react? What do they do? Because every government they normally don't plan, but they try to come out with a response. Policy, remember, means change. So there are not always policy responses. Many times it is a response. Bring more water, reduce the water, or bring kilos of food. I mean, most of the time the governments react. And few times there are policy responses that become part of the decision making for the long term. So in the case of California, there was this, So I have been studying what happened in Australia during the Millennium Drought. Not all of Australia was affected, but a part that is important in Australia in terms of water was affected. That was the Murray-Darling Basin. So what happened? What did the government decide to do? Have those decisions stayed until now in terms of domestic consumption and water for agriculture? That's my interest. And then I started studying California. And I looked at California. US is a wonderful place to study because it is documented. There are things I just cannot find in Mexico. In Europe, in spite of being Europe, many of the countries do not report. And then forget that we developing countries, we study in a different way. We don't document everything. US documents everything. And everything, all the material is open. One can access it for free. Well, unless the government has decided that nobody should see that. You know, all our governments keep some documents aside for a certain number of years. And after a certain number of years, they decide that that can be public again. And even then you come and see the memos, and somebody came with this black pen, and they took out many things. Okay, but this is, we're talking about documentation, technical documentation is likely to be available. So what happened in California during the drought? 2011, 2016, there was a drought. And it has been the most severe for 2,400 years. It said those people who study hydrology. I don't. It was because of the severity, because there was no snowpack, there was no rainfall, and because of the temperature. Temperature was very high. So evaporation and evapotranspiration was much higher. And how did the government respond? This is what is showing what was happening this time of the year. We see that this part of the United States, the western part, was going through a very severe drought, as well as in these small parts. The importance of California and also of the Florida is that they produce food that is not produced anywhere else in the United States, and that is exported to the whole world. You see, when we talk about climate change, and it is said that because of the increase in temperature, the balance of many systems is breaking. Our systems are stressed, and with all these environmental changes, we still don't know how to respond to. We don't know what to do. Our responses are not appropriate, and our responses are not timely. We just don't know. And in the case of California, what happened was that the government, this was gradual. This is a view, September 2011, and then in December 2015. And again, the red there, it is the most severe the drought it is. And there were the three types of drought, which was the meteorological, there was the lack of precipitation, the agricultural, which is lack of soil moisture, and hydrologic drought, which is reduced stream flow or groundwater levels. So they were affected, entirely affected. And what did the people who study, because everybody started studying California, that the period between 2011 and fall 2011, 2015 was the driest since 1895, when the records started. Why is there more impact? In 1800, there were less people. In 1800, less food was produced. And in 1800, people have a hut, not a super mansion in Hollywood, right? So what the insurance companies consider is how much you have and what is their price. So when we see statistics that this year the losses were enormous, we think that that the disaster was 3 times the size. Many times it's not, except people had more, so people lost more. Instead of having your small thing with whatever, where you used to cool down whatever food you had, now you have your super cooler or your super deep freezer that costs 3 times more. Or if there is a flood, instead of losing your normal telephone, the one you used to dial, I don't know if any of you has ever dialed a telephone, but now you lose the 3 apples everybody has and the super fancy car, so it's more expensive. So every time we hear about extreme events and disasters, let's take a little bit more time and see what happened. Many times it's a huge disaster, like sometimes that happens simply because the towns are wiped out, but many times it's just because of the cost of the things that were lost. People have more, and things are more expensive. So the drought in California was considered as the most severe drought in the last 1,200 years because of the variability of precipitation and the record high temperatures. It was just very hot, very, very hot. Not only it rained less, but it was very hot. 2013, the lowest ever annual precipitation in numerous communities, and you have rural communities, and not everybody is rich. And finally, it was declared an official state of emergency. This is important because there are additional funds that will be released at different times. But the government declares several official states of emergency, and the federal government also provided enormous amount of funds. And let's see what is What else was happened? What else happened? What else was done? What we did was that we went to the different records that we could find. So what was the production changes? Did it affect the world? Did people in Singapore stop eating strawberries or lemons in different parts of the United States because of the drought in the drought in California? And we studied 42 crop commodities. They are not crops. This is not food. They become commodities in the markets. That is what at the end the food we need becomes. It is a matter of commodities. And who is willing to pay more? We tend to take a look at the impacts that the climate can have, and of course it has in many cases. And we think that if there is, as the IPCC says and many governments repeat, if there are these big floods or these big droughts, there won't be food, and we hear that all the time. There is going to be a problem, an impact in terms of food, and we won't get it. The poorest countries will starve, or the countries that won't be able to pay for them, right? That's the point. It comes to paying. There is trade, and we know that there is a trade system. We know that in 2008 and 2009, there were very big problems in the world as a result of which tons of food didn't reach the poorest places in the world, and people were starving. How can you imagine a world where people can starve when there is so much food in many places? Because of trade. Because of trade, and because of prices, and because of agreements. So we studied these 42 crops, 42 commodities. We saw imports, exports, and pricing. Is it that the price of the lemons, and I continue mentioning lemons because it's one of the products that are produced only in California. You see that the price was very high, and then you felt people somewhere else perhaps couldn't buy the lemons. First, because they were not available. Whatever amount was available was very, very expensive. It was not. Was it that somewhere in US, these 42 commodities that California, of which California produces 90% of more, people in the United States didn't have access to them? No. It didn't happen. And it didn't happen because there was groundwater and because you can buy it from somewhere else, right? So it's not like we are isolated in an island. Even Singapore, the island that leaves 90% of food, imports 90% of food, wasn't affected. And it's not affected because of markets. So if we think on these extreme events, on the floods and the droughts, that they affect big droughts, and you lose all the harvest of corn, this will have an impact because of the people who eat the corn, because of biofuels, you remember? That is something US has done. US has decided to use a certain amount of corn for biofuels. And the year that US withdrew from the market a certain amount of corn for their biofuel, the world felt it because that amount of corn was not available for sale. And then the government didn't want to sell. They just didn't know what to do. They said, well, for the time being, I'm not going to sell anything until I don't know what happens. I need to feed my people. But if you have a world where people eat only what they can produce, then we would have a problem. There is also a lot of talk on a topic which I find that is not very useful because it's very theoretical, which is the virtual water. Right? Many people talk about virtual water. Anything that is virtual, remember, will remain virtual. Therefore, it's not very practical. But the idea is that if we produce, we as a country, right, we produce goods for which you need a lot of water, and you're in a water scarce area, that you may wish to consider growing something else. Why are you going to use so much water if you don't have it? And countries do it because they have markets. Countries do it because they don't manage properly, but countries do it also because there are reasons. For many years, Saudi Arabia was criticized because they were producing wheat in the desert. And people were saying, why did you produce wheat? Isn't it cheaper to buy it? Because you are using too much water. No, you are not using only too much water. You are using too much water, too much energy. Perhaps the soil is not the best. Perhaps you need more fertilizer. And the point that the objective that Saudi Arabia was pursuing was to settle the nomadic populations. That's what they wanted. You remember in history, we are told when we are in primary school that the population before were nomadic, and until they developed agriculture, they settled. That is what Saudi Arabia wanted. They wanted to settle the people, and for that they were producing wheat. And of course there was a huge illegal market because they were smuggling wheat from somewhere else and then selling it like Saudi Arabian and charging too much. My point with these examples is for all of us to think that there is everything is interrelated, and we have to learn to see whatever problem or whatever situation, we have to see it from a broader perspective. It's not because the temperature is increasing or because the drought or the flood, you are going to lose all you produce and then you are going to starve. No, because there is trade. The world will suffer if there is trade. There are some very interesting publications from a group in UK, from the Chatham House, and they pick up the vulnerable points in terms of trade. What would happen in the world if they call them choke points, if these points were disturbed? And then you see problems. You see many more problems than with droughts and floods, because we have a very big world, because the world is very diverse. So if you have a drought or a flood, it's not likely to be all over the world. If it is all over the world, yes, humankind will be a problem. But if you have these most important points of trade disturbed, we wouldn't be eating that we import, because the trade would be disturbed. And it's not only Singapore, a country that imports so much food. There are many other places that import a lot of food. So this is a story why I got interested into the impacts of extreme events in food. Does it have that impact? Is it like IPCC has said several times that we are going to have changes in the short term? Now, India is very big. India is a subcontinent. If something happens somewhere else, perhaps India will never feel it, because it's so big that it can source what it needs from different states. What you need is to have good relations with the other states. That is what one needs. Would small places, would Bahrain, that is small, or poor places like Honduras or El Salvador, would these countries be in trouble? Oh yes, but they would be in trouble without droughts and floods somewhere else in the world. Your management and your governance is many times what is decisive for a good outcome, a good successful or not successful. In the case of California, the reason why people didn't starve was because the government stepped in. As in the case of Australia, we're talking about two developed countries, right? Two wealthy countries. In both cases, farmers were affected. In both cases, there were farmers who lost everything they had, and they had to get coupons to eat. So situation was not easy. In both places, flora, fauna died. But if we talk about food, if we isolate this element, that just to study it, there was no impact. No impact in terms of price. US didn't have to produce more, import more. And the export prices didn't increase. But this was because there was groundwater available. Every time we have to see what element is available. In the case of California, there was less rainfall, less surface water. So what happens is what happens everywhere. If you don't have surface water, you use groundwater. If you don't have groundwater, but you have more surface water, that is what you use. And this is what happened in California, but this is what has been happening for decades. What we see here, this is one place we're going to see in the map of California where this San Joaquin, it's pronounced in English, I guess, the precipitation, how it has been throughout the years. We see that the lowest one was one in 1976, 1977. So this is a place where there have been droughts before. Population, remember, has been different in different times of history, population, economic activities. And the second lowest was the 2014-2015. By then, California had Silicon Valley, had Hollywood, had what else? Had millions of immigrants from all over, had a very vibrant cities. So the situation between the 70s and the 2000s had changed. You need more because you are bigger. Your economic activities will bring you more income. Then we see the average. This is the average from 1961 to 2000, and we see the difference between the 2014 and the average. And there was a big difference. So all this water was the water that was not available, surface water. and the snowpacks. That is what we could all see in the news, that there was a governor standing up in a place that it was like summer, and he said, this is winter, there is no snow, which means there won't be water. The reservoirs. What happened with the reservoirs? There was less water, right? The reservoirs out of surface water, and they had less water. And here we can see the level. This is in January 2014, and what was the historical average. Once you have water in your reservoirs, we construct our reservoirs and we plan for a certain number of years. We know more or less the amount of water we are going to have in the reservoirs. And then we plan for the activities. I will be able to deliver certain amount of water for certain use. This is going to include hydropower, if it is for hydropower, if it's for irrigation, if it is for domestic use. So I distribute the water, allocate the water. And in California, like in Australia, there are these water markets that in this case, they help a lot. But then you don't have water. So what do you tell everybody? We don't have water. How do we distribute, how do we redistribute the water? And this was with markets. I'm not going to talk about the market, but it's just to tell you that in California there are water markets. There are people who have their water right. This is my water right. My water right was signed 100 years ago. Normally, the ones who saw the water rights, or they got the water rights 100 years ago or more, are people who are whose business is irrigation. I mean, they are in agriculture. Environment, let's remember, came to the, people realized that environment was not a tree. People realized that environment was the place where we live and that environment needs water. So after 100 years, people got their titles or their rights for environment. In California, as in Australia, the person who has the oldest water rights takes priority. So environment didn't receive water during the drought. And it was not a matter of discrimination. It was a matter, you are the junior water holders, right holders. These are the people who have had it for longer time. But even then they organize themselves. What happened with generation of hydropower, I mean of electricity? Also was less, because there was less water. So there was an impact in the life of the people. There was an impact in terms of electricity, and there was an impact on every activity for which surface water was necessary. But what happened in terms of agriculture? What happens if you produce maize, and what happens if you produce pistachios, or you produce crops that will be paid at a higher value, and you don't have water? What do you do? What do you decide to do? Let's think, you have field crops. You have rice, you have sorghum, you have corn, for which you are going to get a price that is this much. And then you have the tree nuts, the crops, that are paid like this. So when you are in business, you decide what you're going to grow, right? Mm-hmm. Yes? No, you should say, you grow the ones with which you are going to get more money. That is what happened. And that is what has been happening with years. Throughout time, what people have moved from the crops that have a lower value to the ones that have a higher value. And then you don't grow a tree, you don't grow a pistachio tree or the almonds, you don't grow them overnight. You need time. So your investment is going to be in the long term. So this has meant that people who have field crops pay certain amount of water for the water, but get also certain amount of income for their crop. But I learned during the course of this study that the rice that is produced in certain parts of California is like a specialty rice, and is very expensive. But it won't be as expensive as the pistachios. The most expensive crops here are the tree nuts. They are the most expensive ones. So if we are in the middle of a drought, what do you do? What do you do if you owe 10 liters of water and you are going to invest them in corn, which is very cheap? What do? Do you use it to grow your corn to be paid by liter. Right. So what do? You sell it. You sell the water. And that's what happened. And that is what the markets in California allow, that the farmers could sell their water to people who would be willing to pay more. Because if I have my almond trees, I don't want to lose them because they are an investment for several years. I have been investing for them. So I have planned, business-wise, I have planned, I need water. And I have to pay more for water. But I know that they will be sold at the market at a certain value. And that is what is happening here. What happened was that the people who ran out of the business were the ones who had the field crops. And there were people who were really, really in bad shape. And they received help from the government. People who ended up paying a lot for the water were the people who had the most valuable crops, market-wise, because they didn't want to lose them. That, second, the aquifer that we're going to see, as in the case of Mexico City, that has been overexploited for many years, suffer the most because there is groundwater available. And I remember reading that the people who sell the pumps to this area of California, they said that they were doing very good business because even though the government said you shouldn't continue pumping, you go and you buy your pump and you pump water every time from deeper. So these are the groundwater level. This is the groundwater level change between 2010, pre-drought, and 2015. 2016 it started raining. And the red dots, what we have, the red ones is where the depth of the groundwater decreased by 10 feet. The orange ones, when they decrease, the groundwater decreased 10 to 2.5 feet. The one that is light yellow, about 2.5 feet, and the other ones where there was no decrease. But if we go back to the map of California, we see how many points is red. So a situation that was already bad, it just became worse because people needed groundwater. And this is for irrigation. People needed groundwater because you don't have surface water. So you use your other option, which is groundwater. This is an image like the one we had in the case for Mexico City. What is the change in groundwater elevation? And Dr. Venkatesh, if you can enlighten us with any comment, please. You know much more on this. But what it shows, for example, in the case in the change in groundwater elevation, the areas that are in blue, there is a change of 50 feet or more. 50 feet, right? That's not so small. You have 50 feet or 20 feet, or in some cases there was no decrease. So the overexploitation of the aquifer has been going on for decades. Every time there is a drought, the farmers use more groundwater because they have it and they can pump. You just have to pay for a bigger pump, and then you have to see the quality of the water you are getting because every time will be deeper. But we see that the entire irrigation area, the entire area that is fertile in California, the entire area has problems in terms of groundwater. So for how long is it going to last? Let's see. Now let's go to land subsidence. We saw land subsidence in Mexico City. Now let's see land subsidence also here in the California Valley, where so much groundwater has been extracted. And we see, well, we see a lot of information. And if any of you want to come, or all of you want to come to see it closer, you are most welcome. We have at the top the reported subsidence location. This is very important. It's not that there is no subsidence in another places, but this is the places where it has been reported. Many times it comes to who has reported. So we have the subsidence location, but then we have you have stations and you continue monitoring the subsidence. The larger the circle, the more subsidence there has been. Now, looking towards the future, what do they think is going to happen? Well, that there will be much more subsidence because pumping is not going to stop because there is no other way you can grow your crops. Well, yes, surface water, but the surface water has another cost, and the most important cost is whether it is available or not. So I want you to see this part because this is the part that was most affected during this drought. So I put it here in a circle, right? We see El Nido and we see this valley. So pay attention. here to El Nido, where we have this big circle where it says there is more subsidence. So this is what has been happening here in El Nido. Every time there is a drought, groundwater is overused. And so this is the drought, the previous one, 2008, 2009. This is from 2013 to 2015. And we see that every time the groundwater goes down, this is the groundwater level, the line in blue, and then also the subsidence. So it goes one with the other. So there are more impacts. There are more impacts than only food. You will have food as long as you can grow it, and you can grow it as long as you have water. If you don't have surface water, then they use your plan B, and your plan B is groundwater. And in this area in California is they have been over-exploiting the aquifer so much that the government worries what is going to happen. So we're going to see that one of the legislations that was passed is that you cannot continue doing this, people. There must be groundwater management to be enforced, listen to this, in 2041. So you are in 2015. You are in the middle of a very serious problem. You have lots of people who have lost their livelihoods, and then you are saying that there will be, you come out with a legislation and you say, but there will have to be groundwater management in 25 years' time. So why would you do that? Let's think. It's not inefficiency. I mean, if it was Mexico, it would be inefficiency, but it's not. Why was it that you decide to implement the law so far from the moment when the problem exists and when you see that the problem has happened before? It's not the first time. So you know, if there is another drought, it's going to happen the same. So let's think. Why until 2041? Ideas. Why the government didn't say from next year, not from tomorrow, right? From next year, you cannot pump. And why until 2041? Which means more than 25 years. Why?
The groundwater will go below, go down. That's why they are not allowing.
That, but they won't allow it 25 years, in 25 years. So my question is, why not now and why so much time?
Because there is some investment in businesses, so they will
Right.
lose.
Exactly. So that is one. So what does that mean? You have to give people time to prepare. People need to develop another alternative. And if they won't be using this amount of water, you have to provide at least, they already know that they will not be able to do it from certain years. But in the meantime, what would you do? Right? What would they do? It's not like they can close their businesses. So exactly was because of that. People need to prepare. And this sector, this agricultural sector, is very important for the state. So it's not only the farmers, but it's the state itself, the one who would suffer if they decided to make effective this law. But then we know overuse of the drought and the extraction of groundwater and the subsidence have gone hand by hand. They have been together at least during this time. So what happened during this time in terms of water? There was less surface water because it rained less. There was no snowpacks. So necessarily, less water was distributed. In 2014, 37% less water was distributed, less. 2014, 18% less water was distributed. So like you were saying, if you have a business and you see this water, you are receiving less water, and you still want to produce as your livelihood, you find the alternative, which is groundwater. So this takes us to groundwater. If we receive the 2016 and 17, they are estimated because this is a study from before. Let me see, this was published in 2015. So you receive less water, therefore you use more water. So additional groundwater pumping was, in 2014, 60% more. In 2015, 72% more. So this, everybody was getting worried. I mean, at what will be the water, the quality of the water we will be pumping out? the net water declines 6% that increased to 10% the following year. And the cost for groundwater pumping, in 2014, it was plus 58%, 454 million US dollars. The following year, it had increased to 75%. So everybody was worried. Like, how much money will I have to continue investing? I need to sell my crops, and the state, this is what I think as a farmer, this is what the farmers saw, but the state had to provide solutions. I have to provide a solution in the long term or in the medium term, but I also have to provide solutions. I have to provide more help. And there was an enormous amount of help, which we are going to see. But first, let me show you what didn't happen. This is what didn't happen. These are 13 crops in which California ranks the #1 in the country. And yes, #1 in total volume of US production. That was in 2015. But it was the same 2014, 2013, because we saw it several years. And we saw that the production, you see, percentage of volume of the production in US, it was still very high, and in some cases it continued being 100%. So that means that if there is a drought, if there is an extreme event, not necessarily your food is going to be affected. Because this extreme event, this drought everybody was talking about, was considering only the snowpack, not the groundwater. In 2011, there was a very serious drought in the center of the United States. No groundwater, farmers lost absolutely everything because you didn't have your alternate resource. As long as there is groundwater, the cities will continue growing, agricultural area will continue growing. So this is what didn't happen. In another places, much less, where with much less, an event that was much less severe, perhaps would have had worse, the result would have been much worse if there had not been groundwater and if the government had not stepped in as it is. That is what we are going to see. But this is what didn't happen. And then we have some nice graphs where it shows how from 1990 until 2015, the different crops, the production has changed. So it's not because of the drought. It's because of the amount of water you have available, whether it comes from surface water or groundwater. These are the most expensive ones, the almond, the pistachios, the walnuts. And let me tell you that great percentage of almonds and pistachios that are eaten in the world come from California. And nobody felt it. And it wasn't felt because nothing happened in California. I mean, it happened with the groundwater, but not in terms of production. If we see, it increased with the years because all the investment was there. And many farmers, not because of the drought, but because of the price of the crop, what California has seen is that more farmers have invested more in this type of crops because they know, I mean, there is a proof for decades, they have been the most expensive crops. We like eating them. So we are willing to pay more than for a tomato or for a lemon. So people invest more in these crops. And this didn't make any sense. So this is the production of the crops, nothing to do with the drought. Many times it's just the management of the crop. You cannot see this one, so I won't emphasize that. The point was that in absolute terms, in the numbers, there was also no difference. So what did the government do, besides from getting very, very, very worried? And yesterday, Dr. Venkatesh said something which is very true. When you have outdoor uses, the first thing that you try to reduce is the outdoor uses. And this happened in California and it happened in Australia. And there was in several places in California this big announcement: do not waste water, save water. You are fine if you are washing the car with the hose. And people don't clean the sidewalk with the hose. There is no water. So you cut outdoor uses of water and you reduce a lot, which is what doesn't happen in Singapore because we don't have outdoor uses, or they are minimum. So in the case of California, there was a task force. First thing, let's put a drought task force. Let's think all together, how can we improve the situation? How can we help? And how can we try to prevent this in the future? Well, there is nothing you can do to prevent a drought. But what you can prevent is the impact it's going to have on the people as on livelihoods and also on the different economic activities. And there was a long list of policy changes. Look, this is very important because this is more difficult to happen when the situation is not stressing. Policy changes, not policy proposals, but a change, which means that next time this is what is going to be implemented. A review of the flow requirement for drought-related projects. You can read here, more water could be recycled, more water could be reused. There would be this 25 reduction on use of water, mostly outdoors use, penalties if you use water, if you were wasting the water. In the case of California, the right holders, the people who own the water, can use it for certain purposes, and here it was okay. They could deviate from the purpose for which they had been given the right. It was fine. They were in this was an extreme situation. So basically, there were more penalties, and the amount of water that was wasted was reduced. So those were the policy changes. Policy changes from the California state government. Now, policy changes from the federal government that also stepped in and gave a lot of money. Funding of millions of dollars to support workers, farmers, rural communities who lost their livelihoods. Crop insurance, the coverage. There were conservation services at some point because there was very little water in the rivers. There would be trucks, and they would be filling up the trucks with some water and the fishes, and they would take them to the delta so that they didn't die. So we have funding for different purposes, but it's basically funding. And the Congress also reauthorized, which means it had been authorized before, reauthorized drought programs, agricultural assistance. So things that you had done before, but it was not necessary until until an extreme event happened. But this is preparedness. When we hear the IPCC saying and the government repeating, oh, we have to prepare, it's not that we have to be worried all the time, but it's preparedness in terms of policy. What will be your policy instruments? You have to be prepared if there is another drought this severe. What did you learn from the previous time? Which is what doesn't seem to happen in the case of our cities and our countries. We don't learn. And in this case, I don't know if they did, but certainly in this area is so wealthy from the point of view of agriculture that the farmers did learn. This is the act I mentioned before. 2014, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was signed into law to be implemented. I'm sorry, I said 2041, it's 2042, to be implemented so many years later. And it prioritizes basins in order to address the more threatened basins first. But if we see, the whole basin is at high risk because the whole basin has been, there's been over extraction of water for many years. And just when I was finishing this research, in 2016, I read this very interesting paper that was published in Nature, you know, one of these high impact factor journals that publish lots of interesting things. And what was being reported in this article is that an aquifer that was at a lower level had been found. And then everybody was so happy because they said there is water. So that means, and I don't know if that is what it means because it had just been published, but the general thought was two things. One, we as farmers, will we be able to continue using all the groundwater? Because it had been said scientifically that there is more groundwater. So can we continue using it? And second, the government, can they continue using it? I mean, can we continue having such an important industry, such an important economic activity in a place where you are depleting your resources? Is this new resource that has been found, because it was there, but the one that has been found, is it enough to continue providing for water for all this industry that makes us one of the richest states in the country? California is the 7th or the 8th economy in the world, not only because of agriculture, but because of Hollywood. But it's a very wealthy state as a whole. And much of it is based on these resources that are available. And that is the purpose for the law, let's try to conserve the resources. But then you have a lot of pressure because of the economic activities that depend on that resource. And it's very much the same thing with, we can compare it with fisheries in the world. We read that the big banks of fishes are over in the world. They have been depleted. And that the Europeans and the Japanese and the Americans have been depleting the fisheries, the banks all over the world. So they go into Africa, they go into less developed countries. And because people want to eat. So should we change certain habits so that we can live longer and we can live better? And that's a question mark. You may remember that years ago we all saw in the news and in the television, we also saw all these pirates that were in Somalia. And they would come and they would attack the fishing boats. And they would, I mean, that was a carnage, that was not, that was a very bad situation, but they would kidnap people and either they would kill them or they would ask for ransom to the countries. And one of them even went to The Hague and he defended himself. Because there were these pirates in Somalia, and because they didn't allow the big fishing boats from Europe and from Japan to come closer to the coast, the fisheries again existed. So what we need is to allow the resource to reproduce, which we are not allowing naturally, which is not being allowed in the case of groundwater here or in the case of the fisheries anywhere in the world. We are basically depleting resources. And for that, we need management. Many times we talk about finance. Yes, it's necessary, but we need management. We need planning, and we need human resources who are able to take the correct decisions or the appropriate decisions. So at the end, numerous decisions were taken by the state government and by the federal government. They were in terms of funding. They were helping the farmers. They didn't want, I mean, the farmers who had lost all their livelihood, but also the state didn't want that all this investment was lost. Millions of dollars are invested in these areas. At the same time, there is the idea that the resource should not be continued overuse. And so they came out with the idea of the act, of the Groundwater Management Act, to be implemented after you think that they have had time, they and you, to sit down together and try to develop a second resource. Or how do you have to modify your production so that you don't require groundwater at this much? But if you have a drought, what else can you do? Do you go out of business, or do you go out of business from now? At this point, you could see the announcements in the newspapers from several states in places where there was no drought, offering the dairy industries to move to their states. You need water for dairy, for agriculture. You need water for every single activity. So other states were just offering help for them to relocate. So this is a list that you don't have to read. I mean, each one of them. But my point here is just to show there was finance support, there were regulations, and there was a law. And there was a lot of awareness. People knew what a severe drought could be. And we continue hearing in the world that there are these extreme events. Either we have very severe floods in some places, or we have severe droughts in other places. And we read and we hear of the suffering of people in those specific locations, and what are the responses of the government. But then what we have to do at different levels, as a student, as a civil servant, as an engineer, we have to think, what alternatives do we have? Alternatives in the long term. Because for places like California, you need an alternative in the long term. For cities like Mexico City, you need a solution in the long term. And how much of that we can do, never as one engineer, as one civil servant, as one student. That's why we talk about working together, because the dimension of this problem is so big that we precisely require the big solutions for which we need many members of society. And let me see, that is it. But what I wanted to show you with the two presentations today is two different cases where you depend on sources that are getting depleted. One, an urban area, Mexico City, that has grown very much, the greater Mexico City, that it depends on the aquifer that is being overexploited. And then we have agricultural production in another place. This is a state, but again, where your main resource is groundwater. Disadvantage of groundwater, you don't see it. We see when the surface water is when the level of the dams is less. We see when there is less water in the rivers or in the lakes, or when they are polluted. We don't see groundwater. We don't always meter groundwater. So always groundwater is at a disadvantage. We can overuse it and we can pollute it and nobody will see it, except the one who will use it, contrary to surface water. So these are two very different cases, the urban one and the one that is more agricultural, but that it has an impact. Because the more water you use, we're in a system, right? The more water you use, even for agricultural purpose or whatever purpose is, will have an impact on the water you will be able to use for another uses, in this case, for the cities. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Cecilia, for sharing the case study of the Mexico and other information. As Madam said, the surface water and the groundwater, Mexico, they use 30% groundwater,
70%
70%
groundwater.
and 30% is the surface water. This is really the alarming, because surface water every year we can renew it, but the groundwater, once we use it, very difficult to refill it. And like morning also, Dr. Venki was discussing